Hi, it's April 11th, 2024. I'm honored to have with me Professor Norman Fenton. Professor Fenton, tell us how you've been and what are you working on right now?
I've been so-so. Still been working on kind of like vaccine efficacy stuff and vaccine safety efficacy. I'll be speaking next week in a meeting which is being held in the Italian Parliament in Rome with a bunch of other speakers about vaccine efficacy and safety. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about that whole idea of that cheap trick, which we've recently done some more work on. Basically, this is the trick whereby if you classify people who get infected shortly after vaccination as unvaccinated, within something like 14, 21 days, then it's certain that when you do a vaccine rollout, it's a statistical certainty that you'll get very high efficiency for a few weeks before it eventually tapers off after about 3 months, and then hey presto, you need a booster or the second dose or whatever it is. And we've been talking about that for actually for 3 years. I've been raising this, and every so often when there's a major study published which claims very high efficacy for the COVID vaccines, or the very high safety compared to people who are not vaccinated, it turns out that in almost all those, or actually all the cases we looked at, there was some instance of this misclassification, the cheap trick. We're not saying it was the whole story. There are plenty of other biases in these things, but there was no doubt that was biasing these studies in favor of the narrative of vaccine high efficacy and safety. But we didn't know how widespread this was. So we actually decided just before, about a few months ago, to do a systematic review. So this is the first systematic review of all trials and studies, all novel trials and studies which were claiming vaccine efficacy and safety. We did the sort of the classic search of PubMed and Scopus or whatever the big journal databases that are where the major studies are published. And we got on the sort of the basic searches, there were a couple of thousand papers, but actually for those that it turned out there were only 34, I think, on the major sites where they were describing a genuinely novel study attempting to show either retrospective or whatever, trying to show that the vaccines were safe and effective. We found another 4 which were cited in those, so basically 38 in all, and basically 37 of them, 37 and 38, used some form of the cheap trick. These were all, one way or the other, massively exaggerated. Whatever their results were, they were massively exaggerated, because as I say, you'd be seeing similar type of results, not just with a placebo vaccine, but actually with a negative efficacy vaccine as well, vaccine which is genuinely bad. I mean, if you think about it logically, people have said, you can go and see how that people. If you think about it, just think about the worst possible case. What's the worst case scenario, right? Imagine a vaccine which is supposed to stop you getting disease X. Imagine you give that to 1,000 people, and 1,000 other people don't get it, right? Now, imagine if those 1,000 people within the first 2 weeks all got disease X, then they're going to be classified as unvaccinated, those people, right? And anybody who does, anybody who, and what's more, if they're all getting it, they're not going to get it within the 3 months of study, because you could presume that whatever it is, they're going to have some immunity from getting that again within 3 months, let's say, the period of the study. Therefore, however you measure efficacy, it's going to come out 100% efficacy for the vaccine, because the only people who are going to be classified as getting the virus are going to be the unvaccinated, because there'll be a few of those obviously getting the disease X. And so because of the way vaccine efficacy is defined, which is 1 minus the proportion of people with the vaccine who get disease X divided by the proportion of those who don't get the vaccine who get disease X. So you've got 0 at the top, right? So 1 minus 0 is 1, and it's always, you make that percentage 100% efficacy. You guaranteed it, right? So that's an extreme case, and and of course, but even in the non-extreme cases, even if you're only seeing like a very small proportion, an equal proportion of the vaccinated, unvaccinated getting it each week, but for those who are the most recently vaccinated, you shift those into the vaccinated column, then you still get this illusion. So it was far more widespread. The interesting thing about that is that we actually managed to get that. We sent it for peer review to one of the major journals. Can't remember which. I haven't heard yet. But medRxiv, which is one of the preprint servers, that's actually been automatically rejecting all of our papers which have questioned the COVID narrative. Actually accepted it. So the things are, we thought things are maybe shifting a little bit in terms of what you are and aren't allowed to say about vaccine safety. Yeah, so that's one thing. And the other thing, I've been doing work. There's a couple of stories which I've been involved with about the vaccines relating to pregnant women. So I'm happy to. They're 2 different stories actually, which are quite interesting in their own right, which I'm happy to tell you about.
Yeah, please go ahead. I mean, I just had one quick question about the first one. A cheap trick, aside from being a rock and roll band from the 80s, I think it was.
Yeah.
Which cheap trick, are they all using the same cheap trick across? Is it all this 2-week thing, or are they using different cheap tricks?
It's different cheap tricks because you can do it in one. So people said, well, okay, the classic one is to simply classify people who get the virus within 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the vaccination. You classify as unvaccinated, or if you're going to the second dose, then people who get the second dose and get the virus within 3 weeks of that, 2-3 weeks of that, they're classified as only 1 dose, etc. Right? That's the most, by far the most common. I think all of them use some form of that. Oh, but there is another version which is where you simply say, okay, well, we're not going to count those who get the vaccine but get the virus within 2 weeks, or it's usually actually 3 weeks. The Office of National Statistics uses 3 weeks. It's even more ridiculous, right? Anyone who gets it within 3 weeks, we'll simply not count them at all. We won't count them at all as part of this, right? And therefore they're saying, well, there's no bias there. Well, no, the bias works almost exactly the same if you do that, right? Which my extreme case kind of like confirms. Extreme case, of course, where if everybody gets it in the first 3 weeks, you're going to get 100% efficacy if you're counting all those as if you're simply removing those, because you've still means you'd have no vaccinated people getting the virus. So there are other things. So some of them. There are other types of misclassification which are a little bit more subtle, but generally that's the way they do it. It's almost standard. It's this idea that you shouldn't be considered vaccinated. You've got to give the vaccine a chance, right? Well, fine. You can kind of like accept that argument, right? Actually, you can accept that argument for other types of disease. I'm not sure you accept it for something like a flu-type virus, because this thing, is likely. Well, we know. I mean, I'll tell you, the only time I ever got flu in my life was the one time I got the flu vaccine. I got it really bad within 24 hours. So, I mean, we know that this sort of thing happen. And we also know, incidentally, we've got empirical results from some of these studies which show that people the vaccinated are more likely to get or to be PCR positive within those first few weeks than someone who's unvaccinated at the same time. So we know this. We know that's when they're most likely to get it. So it's all, whichever way you do it. If you're then saying, well, we're not going to count those because you can't count them as vaccinated, right? Well, then fine, but don't use that information in claims of vaccine efficacy.
Right. They need to be their own category. Do you know Anthony Daniels, a.k.a. Theodore Dalrymple?
Yeah, well, yeah, I know the work, of course, yeah.
So not that it's quite related, but he has a book, which I really enjoyed. I think it's 2019 or so, maybe a little earlier. I think it's called False Positive. He goes through a year of the New England Journal of Medicine and picks an article a week, and which have some form of mathematical, statistical fallacy or other. Yeah. most of them are, a lot of them are like post hoc or propter hoc. There are a lot of logical jumps and leaps and finding things that people want to find, and we're seeing more of that. I mean, obviously you're familiar with probably both the group that put the AI generated absurd articles, got them into social science journals, and the John Ioannidis study that said about half of studies come out with information that's just unreproducible, which I suppose is not useful information at all. On one level, the fact that half does and half don't, does that invalidate the half that does is just being randomly correct?
Yeah, exactly, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's quite the case. I mean, I think it's a little deeper.
I reckon it is. I think it probably is, actually. For most of the medical studies. So it might be worse, because you remember that there's this thing whereby if the medical study, let's say, which is looking at the effectiveness of some new treatment or whatever it is, you're not going to remember in many cases if the study shows it's not effective, they don't bother publishing it.
That's a good point. So you have.
I mean, they tried to fix this problem by forcing any of the funded studies, at least any of the publicly funded studies, to put their hypothesis to register the study first. So the idea is you have to publish the results, good or bad, but it doesn't really. I don't think that really happens, because it still has to go through peer review. So you can easily foul peer review of a really crappily, badly written paper about a failed study. If you want to make sure it doesn't get published, you just write it in a very bad, sloppy way. And it's not going to pass peer review. They're still not going to publish it.
So I want to come back to the pregnancy registry. But before I do, I mean, did Einstein's theories go through peer review?
That's a very good question. No, because the point is that I think that his theories, he put his theories out. I don't think he went to. I'm not sure he went first to any of the sort of established scientific journals. No. Yeah.
So my understanding is peer review came into being. I mean, I'm not sure who thought of it, but it came into like functional being in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And, since there were no automobiles, telephones, or any science before 1960, all this makes sense.
I mean, peer review is one of the most corrupt aspects of the already corrupt academia. Funny enough, I mean, I was talking last night with some colleagues, and I was on. We were talking about the fact that I'd been on Brett Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast, and actually the only memorable thing that anybody remembers from that, they were discussing last night, was his comment that if academia is basically like a rabid dog, it just needs to be destroyed completely. He said that. It's not my words, but he said it.
But how long ago were you on?
That was a couple of years ago, at least 2.5 years.
Yeah. Has he had you on for COVID? Or vaccine?
Yes, he was on there. He fun enough covered. He covered, without us being on. He actually did a detailed coverage of talking about our cheap trick stuff. That we were supposed to. I said you should get my colleague Martin on to discuss it. He never did. And then I was supposed to be meeting up with Brett when he came over for the art conference to London, and because there'd been a kind of an interesting. We'd had an interesting exchange of direct messages, because it was actually over the whole Gaza thing, because he bought into this nonsense that it was all an inside job, blah blah, because he was listening to certain supposed people with supposed expertise who were just talking complete bullshit and had no relevant expertise or inside knowledge whatsoever. But he swallowed that story, completely. And we were sort of discussing that, and we were going to follow up with it when he came to London. But for some reason or other, we didn't manage to meet up when he was there. And he hasn't contacted me since. Hi, Brett. If you're listening to this, we'll have to have that.
I think he's a fellow of the Brownstone Institute now, for whom I write.
Right.
I don't know if I'll get a chance to meet him. I think he was on one of the retreats, but that's kind of for the donors and some of the other fellows.
I'll just remind that I'm still waiting for him to follow up on his promise to meet up after the conference. It never happened.
Do you catch up with his brother at all, Eric?
No, I don't know his brother at all. Eric, you're talking about? No.
Well,
but anyway, the pregnancy stuff.
Yeah, but I could pull up a page on that, but why don't you tell us a little bit about it, and I'll be in the background.
Right, so there's a few stories, a few interesting stories entwined here. Back in 2000, it was March 2021. This is a really interesting thing, is that I discovered that the MHRA, which is the not the MHRA, the UKHSA, which is the United Kingdom Health Security Agency. They're the people who had the sort of master control of a lot of the COVID vaccine data, and in particular the pregnancy. They were putting out reports about the pregnancy data. And what I found was they were doing something unbelievably naughty, right, in their publications. They were basically looking at bad outcomes like miscarriages, stillbirths, or whatever, and they were looking to compare. What they should have been doing was looking to compare the outcomes of the vaccinated women with the unvaccinated women. Okay, so you could see whether there was any safety signal, because if you're seeing more miscarriages and stillbirths with women who were vaccinated compared to those who are unvaccinated, then obviously that's a safety signal. Well, they didn't do that. They did something unbelievably naughty. They basically said, well, we're gonna classify all of those who were vaccinated prior to pregnancy, even if it was 1 day prior to pregnancy, and not vaccinated during pregnancy, with all the unvaccinated. So we're going to use that as one category, and we're going to compare that with those who got 1 dose during pregnancy and those who got 2 doses during pregnancy. Now, there are all kinds of, even if they've done it properly, there are problems about this, because you've got things like survival bias, which I've written about as well, so which they weren't taken into account. But the very fact that they were lumping together all women who got pregnant, who'd been vaccinated before pregnancy, with the unvaccinated in these outcomes, means that there was no way you could, that if they were claiming, as they were, that there was no, they were saying there's no difference, the outcomes are, more or less the same. Well, we don't know that, because you've lumped a whole load of people who should have been in the vaccinated category with the unvaccinated. So don't give me that bullshit, right? Anyway, so I wrote about this, right? And it just so happens that a few weeks later, who I regard as Britain's greatest ever, it's not that report, it's the one with the Laura Kenny one. That's the second story. It's related to this, but this one's I think is more important from a sort of an international perspective, because it kind of involves Britain's greatest female athlete of all time, which is, in my opinion, but I think almost universally, is Laura Kenny, formerly Laura Trott, because she has won by far and away the most golds, Olympic golds, of any female UK athlete. Right? She won 5 Olympic golds, which I think the next highest female is 3 at most. So she's well up there. She is the, and it just so happens she revealed. So when I said 2020, I meant March 2022. I was talking about with that UKHSA data. Just a few weeks later, in April, right, this Laura Kenny revealed that she'd suffered 2 tragedies shortly after the Tokyo Olympics, which had taken place in August 2021, right? In November of 2021, which was 3 months after the Olympics, she had a miscarriage, which was a 9-week miscarriage, right? So she got pregnant after the Olympics, miscarried. And then in January 2022, she suffered an ectopic pregnancy. She had incidentally already had prior, I think 4 years before this, had a child with her husband, who's also also a great Olympic athlete, which is, her husband is Jason Kenny. He's also won 7 gold medals. In fact, yeah. So she went public on this happening, right? And it was very clear. It was very clear that these had happened. These pregnancies she'd become pregnant after those Olympics. But I said at the time, I was under the impression, this is interesting, because she would have been almost certainly had to have been double vaccinated to go to those Olympics, because the UK, I'd heard that the British Olympic Association mandated that for all its athletes. But I wasn't claiming that there was any link between the vaccine and her and the miscarriage and the ectopic pregnancy. What I was saying was an absolute fact, which is that whichever way you look at it, those two outcomes, negative outcomes for her, would have been recorded by UKHSA in the category of the unvaccinated, even though she was vaccinated. So I use that as an example, right? A very well-known example. What happened then is that she announced her retirement a couple of weeks ago. So this story, I thought, let's sort of revisit this story, because I know she'd kind of expressed some sort of public views which sort of indicated that she wasn't happy with the sort of Olympic Association in relation to this, but it was never very clear. I was hoping that she would contact me, but she didn't. But she announced her retirement. But in doing so, I thought, I'm going to go and check what happened in this story. In checking it, I discovered it's absolutely a fact. I got the proof. She had to have been vaccinated. She had to have got double vaccinated. So that was no longer speculation. I've got the confirmation that the British Olympic Association did indeed mandate every single British athlete to Tokyo to be double vaccinated before August 2021. So we know that for sure. Anyway, so I put out this story, and I did a short video about it and reminded people of this link to this whole classification problem. And I put it out on YouTube, and within 50 minutes, I'd had over 2,000 views. I'd had 30 comments. I'd had in that space, I think I had something like several hundred likes as well. And blow me down, YouTube, I get a strike on YouTube. They've censored the video for misinformation. Well, I think they say it's for information which doesn't conform to the World Health or whatever, their usual bullshit story. Yeah, medical misinformation. It breaches it's a violation of their medical misinformation policy.
Yeah, you didn't just get a strike. They disappeared it.
Oh, they took it away and gave me and stopped me from posting for a week. Yeah, so I've got a strike. And yeah, and the statement, I believe the statement, it was this statement which I think they said, because I just said, so if you read that, let me just look out. So what I said was that, and this is a fact, right? Once again, we're reminded not just of the extent to which the government had gone to obfuscate possible vaccine adverse reactions, fact, because they were classifying her two adverse reactions as in that unvaccinated in pregnancy group, but also the insanity that led to the strongest and fittest people in Great Britain being forced to take useless vaccine they never needed, and for which even then there were many known safety problems. Those are facts. That vaccine is useless for fit people. There was no way that any young fit athlete should have been taking that vaccine, right? And everybody accepts that now. Even the most, the fanatical vaccine proponents accept that there was no need for the youngest and the fittest to take that thing. So that got me the strike. So that's that. And then the other story, the other pregnancy story, which also relates back to this whole, we come back full circle to this whole thing about peer review, interesting enough, is that at the start of the vaccine rollout, the regulator, the medical health regulator in the UK, it's the Medical Health Regulation Authority, the MHRA, set up this monitoring program, which was an active monitoring program of people who volunteered to be monitored, people who got vaccinated and volunteered to monitor everything that happens to them over a period of whatever, any kind of reactions. I think there was about 25,000 people signed up for this active monitoring. So it's different from the yellow card or the VAERS system, where you may or may not decide that you're going to submit a report if something happens to you after the vaccine. These are people who are signed up, committed to logging. They're sort of obliged to log any sort of adverse reactions they get. So about 25,000 people, of whom about 2,000 or just under were pregnant women, vaccinated pregnant women. Okay. And So we're particularly interested in those pregnant women, right? Now, we saw the interim reports that they put out about the adverse reactions were absolutely horrific, right? Like the AstraZeneca, so they were monitoring the AstraZeneca, Moderna, and Pfizer. And I think in the case, I haven't got the numbers up here, but I think for AstraZeneca, over 60, I think it was 63% of every person who took the AstraZeneca vaccine had some kind of adverse reaction, right? And a lot of them were not trivial adverse reactions. Pfizer, it was about 40%. Moderna was also massive. It was also well over 50%, right? So these were massive safety signals, right? Now you can argue that because they're being actively monitored, they're being encouraged to monitor, to report anything, that they may get less serious things like pain, but actually there wasn't, a lot of these were pretty serious events. In fact, it was so serious, this report, that they referred it to their, whatever the department, whatever the experts are, the pharmacological safety assessment, the supposed statistical analysts within the government statistical office, who are going to basically do a proper safety analysis of this, right? Now, the results of that have never been published, right? To this day, what we know is they stopped the program. They actually stopped. This was supposed to go on for a while. They stopped reporting any of these results, right? But in particular, we wanted to get the pregnancy data because it was clear that there was already nasty safety signals in these, nearly 2,000 pregnant women. And so we did, well, I say we, it was mainly actually a colleague of mine, Cheryl Granger, as the real tenacious person here. I was sort of working with her, but she did all of the sort of the ground, all of the legwork here. She wrote to the she did first the usual freedom of information request to the MHRA to release the data, because they had the data, right, on these pregnant women, and they weren't releasing it. So their response, I mean, they took ages to make a response, right? But in the end, their response was that actually there is a special exemption from the freedom of information, whatever the act is, that you're exempted from this if you're planning to submit a peer-reviewed paper with that data, right? You only have to be planning such a paper. You don't have to commit. You don't have to give a commitment to when you're going to submit this. And of course, there's no guarantee that, as we were discussing before, that a peer-reviewed paper is going to be accepted. In which case, the very fact that you planned and submitted it for peer review, if it doesn't get accepted, then again, you no longer have to produce. You don't have to make these results public. So
that's absurd. I don't see why the data should be like sequestered because somebody might be writing it.
It's incredible. And she wrote again a very detailed letter to because the MHRA had refused it. So she wrote to the Information Commissioner's Office, and they're the people who sit above any of these organizations to determine whether these people are in breach of their FOI requirements. And the only thing they said they were in breach of, funny enough, where they sort of wrapped their knuckles, they didn't reply in time, because you're supposed to reply within, I think it's 28 days, and they failed to do that. But they kind of like backed up, they kind of like supported the MHRA's refusal to publish this data on the basis that, well, we're planning at some point in the future to make it public via a peer-reviewed study. So we're not showing it to you. And of course, when's that? If that ever happens, it's not going to happen for years, and it's it's going to be forgotten by then. And meanwhile, all of these pregnant women who had the vaccine don't know, are being kept in the dark about.
Well, the whole thing was crazy to begin with. I mean, why would you ever vaccinate a pregnant woman? It's like
exactly. They were telling people they couldn't eat soft cheese.
They're facto young, so they're young themselves, and they're healthy enough to get pregnant. So they're not really that much at risk for, unless they're hugely obese, have horrible comorbidities, but that's unlikely if they're in the pregnancy category. And then moreover, why would you do it then? You have the chance. I mean, the placenta is reasonable filter, but why would you do that when there's a baby inside? I mean, we don't let mothers even drink, We recommend they don't drink alcohol. We recommend they don't smoke. We take
Or
away all these
soft
noxious
cheese,
elements.
yeah.
Why would you add one for which the safety profile obviously can't be proven because it hasn't been 5-7 years out? And
Yeah.
why would you do this? And at what point? This is where everything kind of got haywire. I mean, I think the whole thing is not only just unscientific, but it lacks kind of a moral basis. And there's no risk stratification. And it was blindly. I mean, my late mother-in-law who lived through all the COVID shenanigans, whatnot. She wanted to have as many vaccines she could find. She had very little life expectancy either way, and we were happy to let her have as many as she wants. Because it's like, okay, maybe this is a benefit, very little risk, and if it took a few days off her life either way or added a few, you're barely going to notice it. Fine, and maybe for a nursing home, there's some validity and so forth. And if you figure this out, but there's no reason to do it in a school. There's no reason to do it for people who've already had the illness. There's no reason to keep giving this shot over and over again. There's no reason to give this shot after the fact.
Yeah.
I almost got I was attacked. I was technically assaulted at my own club by an MD MPH, Master of Public Health, and he's, I guess, a professor, or quasi-professor at one of the teaching hospitals. Boston's like the medical mecca, and so he has a lot of authority. I was kind of chatting with a mother whose kid was playing squash in front of us, and teenager, like young, like 12 years old, something like that, 13. And this time when the vaccines were coming around, the kid had already had COVID, and I'm like, and we were just chatting. Like I said, if she's healthy, she's already had it. I don't see any reason. Dr. Fauci himself said you should not give vaccines after the fact. If you have the flu, you don't give a flu vaccine, so forth. And so we were just chatting kind of calmly. And this guy, I've never met him before, but I've seen him much one trip. He comes storming in, screams at me like inches from my face, as if I'd committed some crime, and like literally screaming. And I took him to a side room so he wouldn't be doing that in front of everybody else. And there was like no controlling him. And he says, she gets, heart problems from COVID. That's going to be on your hands, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, she's already had COVID. And why would you give her additional risk if the vaccine has some formulation like that? Why would you give her any additional risk?
Yeah.
But anyway, it's just, the whole thing's nonsensical. And,
People lost their minds. People lost their minds.
Yeah. Yeah, so people lose their minds. I mean, we're stuck with being humans, I guess, and that's a lovely situation. But the mathematical statistical world, it seems hard for people to grasp. So what's the way of fixing that? I mean, we can't make people into computers.
Well, I don't know. Klaus Schwab and his cronies seem to think that we can, but yeah.
So have you been working on books at all? Or?
Actually, funny enough, me and Martin Neal, my colleague, are actually are actually in the process of completing a book based on our Substack articles dating back to the start of the pandemic. And the new subtitle for that is that, reflecting the fact that, we now think that there wasn't really any much of a pandemic. There was maybe some, slightly novel virus. You get these novel coronaviruses every so often, but it wasn't deadly. It didn't spread in the way that it was supposed, that they were claiming it was spread in. Most of the real hotspots where you had these devastating mass death events in places like Lombardy and New York and London were clearly the result of the response to the virus rather than the virus itself. And looking back, going through what we were saying at the time, it was, we were saying right from, from the start that this was not what it was being portrayed, but in particular, all of the claims of those massive second and third waves, which were the justification for the second and third lockdowns and for the vaccination program, that was just a case demic. That was all based on the mass testing of asymptomatic people.
Totally.
We knew that. We were saying that at the time. We said that. We had the evidence. We provided real evidence of that by just comparing it with the evidence about, you look at the people who were actually reporting serious symptoms through like the National Health Service in the UK their sort of triage program ambulance. We've got all the data. We had all the data for that. They stopped producing that data after we flagged the massive inconsistencies. So you've got this, on the official government website, all COVID cases, woo, in the winter of 2020, woo, we got a lockdown again. And the only way out of this is the vaccine. Actually, you look at the triage data, the actual people with symptoms, and it's and that was it. There was nothing. There was nothing. It was all a complete scam.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm kind of a broken record on this, but the Diamond Princess. If you wanted to create an experiment such as that, get 3,700 people on a boat and give them this novel virus that nobody had ever heard of, maybe people remember 2003 SARS-1, but no one would sign up for that. All the people who are going on a cruise, they're going to see a little bit of China, a little bit of Japan, I don't know, all throughout East Asia on a beautiful Diamond Princess. That sounds great cruise. It's probably skews elderly and whatnot, and obviously wealthy. Would you get anybody to sign up for that? No, you could, they wouldn't pay for it, and you'd have to give them, I don't know, a couple $1 million, or who knows, dollars each to get people on the boat. So if you stipulate have given people $1 million each, 3,700 people on board, this is if you do the math, it's like a $1 billion experiment that you'd have to arrange. Well, no one ever would. And here they were on the boat, and you could observe them for weeks, and on the boat before anybody let them land in Yokohama and whatnot. And obviously you could observe them quarantine, for some period of time afterwards. And they were. And here it is. And the data showed by the time the lockdowns were produced that basically 0 people had died. By June, months later, kind of to use your example of the vaccinated and unvaccinated, this time lag, they announced that 10 people had died from COVID from COVID on the Diamond Princess, and their median age was 82 or something like that. But this was by June. So that it was, people die because the boat skewed elderly, but were they really dying from COVID if it took them like 3 or 4 months later to die? By the time that Dr. Fauci came up with his, and Birx and whatnot came up with their stratagem to lock people down, social distancing, there had been, I think, 0 to 1 people dead by that time from the COVID from the Diamond Princess, and they had done landfall in China in January 25th. So this is fully 2 months later. Only 1 or 2 people had died. In the acute phase of their COVID experience, nobody had died. And amongst the young people, nobody had got sick. And amongst the kids, nobody knew they had anything. Half the kids showed up positive for the testing for COVID, and none of them had complained of any symptoms at all. So those people would have been called cases. Those kids would have been called cases. But that's a distortion and a misuse of the term case, which typically meant you had something. Case of tuberculosis is different from just showing a positive latent sign of it. And so this was an absurdity, and they all knew it at the time. Like Fauci mentioned the Diamond Princess. I know it was in his consciousness because I have a speech of his, from February that I researched for my Fauci article, and he's talking about the Diamond Princess. And it's like, okay, dude, like it's there. I mean, that's your experiment. I don't know what more you need. You can look at all the people dropping, quote unquote, dropping dead and being left dead in the streets in Wuhan and realize, there is such a thing as, kind of Pallywood propaganda kind of stuff. And who knows what the motivations of China were at that point in time. They were certainly having kind of a cold-ish war with Donald Trump, and they're no friends. So, I mean, who knows what their motivations were, if any. But let's presume there were some, and they're probably on the nefarious side. And this is what you're going to believe. You're going to believe the Chinese data instead of the pretty neutral Diamond Princess. And you can almost find nothing about the Diamond Princess thereafter. It's a lunacy. I just don't know why it wasn't broadcast ever. And this concept of going out and vaccinating, giving people this stuff when that people naive to the vaccine, naive to the virus, nobody got sick under like age 70 or something like that. Craziness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What can you say? Yeah. All of that, absolutely. And did you see, there was an interesting video of Barbara Birx going around this week, where she was talking, which has got all her quotes with how she deliberately undermined the Trump administration and deliberately fooled all of the. Is that yours, sir? And was basically sending all of these official documents, supposedly official White House documents, to all of the governors in all of the states, telling them that they had to abide by these various draconian measures, and they were refusing at first. And so what she then did was hid she said she knew they wouldn't read the whole document, so she put the mandatory requirements at the end, so they were then they accepted them without actually even knowing what they were accepting. She openly was talking about how she sabotaged Trump's attempts to get people like Scott Atlas and I think Jay Bhattacharya as well, and all those people to give the alternative voice. She actually sabotaged the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, Fiddler on the Roof had a song on this. Remember?
Fiddler on the Roof. Sorry.
You know the song from Fiddler on the Roof, Sedition?
Yeah, of course. Sedition. Yeah, of course.
No, I'm just joking. It's tradition, but I'm just thinking we should do a song, Sedition. I mean, I think that is technically sedition, is it not?
Sorry?
I think technically Deborah Burke's actions are sedition.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, in any reasonable administration, she would be, she would be the one arrested now. Incredible.
So you live in London.
Yeah.
How are things in London?
In London, it's very difficult being, as I am, a Jew or an Israel supporter, because it's actually a very, very hostile atmosphere. Because if I go on I can't even sort of travel. You can't travel on the train at the weekend without being confronted by these aggressive Hamas supporters. That's what they are. When they say that they're pro-Palestinians or they're pro-peace, they're not. They're just fanatical. Most of them are outright anti-Semites, or they're certainly anti-Israel obsessives. But they're basically Hamas supporters, which is evidenced by the fact that at the rallies, this one guy is an Iranian guy, not a Jewish guy, who has been putting up a sign saying, Hamas is a terrorist organization, gets attacked at all these rallies. To the extent now the police keep arresting him for disturbing the peace. So he's the one they arrest, and
crazy.
It drives these people crazy that anyone should suggest that Hamas are not the good guys in this. These people.
I don't understand.
And of course, we were discussing this before, but this whole thing has also caused a fissure in the so-called the previously named so-called medical freedom movement, because what became very clear, even on October the 7th, long before Israel did any kind of retaliation against the massacres that were taking place, is that there are many people supposedly in this freedom movement who came out openly as anti-Semites and terrorist supporters. And that's been a very disturbing thing, because you find out who your friends are and people who you'd had some sort of trust in, when you realize they want your, well, in my case, countrymen, because my wife's family, originally from both grandparents from Jerusalem. We have a big family, our closest family is still in Israel. That these people want your family to die, or to be,
well, not just to die,
moved somewhere where they weren't born.
Yeah.
And these are the views of people that are supposed to be our sort of trusted colleagues, and a lot of them, majority of them, that's the most dispiriting thing. And they're also these are people, this is the bizarre thing, these are people who were the ones who saw through all of the bullshit mainstream media. And by that I mean sources like, for example, the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC. They saw through, they realized everything, all of the data that was being pushed by that sort of mainstream media was bullshit on COVID. Yet they believe these are the people now, when they are quoting exactly those sources, they quote the Guardian, the BBC, New York Times for their news on Gaza. These people.
It's a strange thing. Are you familiar with Michael Crichton's term of Gelman amnesia?
And those people, the irony is that those people, and these are people who know nothing. All these people actually know nothing. I of course have intimate knowledge of the situation. I mentioned I've gone public on the fact that, for example, my niece, was actually on one of the scene of one of the kibbutzes, the kibbutz Be'eri attack. She's an on-duty conscript and was there shortly afterwards, whilst the terrorists were actually still there, and saw all of the the aftermath of the massacre, had to pick up dead bodies and dead body parts, all that, and which incidentally, apparently, I had people I know, even on Twitter, actually say to me, "Well, we don't believe you. You know, where's the proof of this?" Right? So you got that.
They were filming it themselves. They had their own GoPro cameras.
I know, but that wasn't enough. So you got all that, and yet these people, this is what irony. There are people who say we're the ones who are suddenly, we don't get it. We saw through all the. They're saying, well, we saw through all the COVID stuff and even the climate change stuff, but we can't see that this whole thing is a psyop as well, and it never really happened. It was an inside job, right? They think that we're the ones who have been deceived by whatever the mainstream media. Yeah, they don't realize the mainstream media, almost universally, is basically accepting the Hamas narrative. It puts out all these Hamas figures on the number of deaths, and we've done statistical. There's been a few statistical analysis. I mean, I've contributed to one of those, showing that those, Hamas fatality, the so-called Gaza fatality figures, the civilian deaths, it's complete bullshit.
Yeah. Well, even if they weren't complete bullshit, I mean, there were 0 Gaza fatalities on October 6th.
Yeah, exactly. And there was
I think they had a ceasefire. If you could do, Buster Keaton and a lot of the silent film stars, they had these incredible stunts. And it turns out they actually walked them backwards. I don't know if you know this, but Charlie Chaplin would have a huge contrivance, a brick or something in front of him, and it'd be on a rope, and they'd pull it backwards, and he'd walk backwards, and then they'd run the thing forward. So he'd be walking along, and this brick would fall right in front of him. Be like, oh my God, he's so incredibly brave. And all these things would happen, and things would be falling one side or another. They would always just miss him, because what they were doing is just running the thing in slow motion backwards. So they'd have the sword coming up, and it wouldn't hurt him. Obviously, it's going the wrong direction. The brick's going the wrong direction, and so forth. So if you could take this movie and roll it backwards, you'd have a ceasefire. All you have to do is go from October 7th back to October 6th, 5th, and so on. You have an endless ceasefire. Like, since 2007, Israel hasn't really set foot there. They pulled their own people out who were screaming and crying under gunpoint.
2005, actually, yeah.
2005, thank you. So 19 years of this, and they left behind infrastructure, like, when they say greenhouses, it's really an understatement. These were huge industrial farms that were able to produce all kinds of, fruits and vegetables year round under the sun there. And so there's millions of dollars, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure that was probably just torched and destroyed because it had the taint of Jewish fingerprints on it. And so you had a ceasefire there. You had the potential to be Singapore. If you roll the film back, I mean, Hong Kong, it's just a piece of rock, pretty much. It's there's not much there. And over the years, they're up against, hard up against, PRC China, not their friend, nobody to trade with, and Hong Kong thrived. And what were their natural resources in Hong Kong? They didn't, what do they have? They got a piece of rock. They got an airport. You have to go almost directly down to get to. And it's a horrible, unsafe place. And everybody's crammed into these things. And the richest place on earth, happiest place on earth, practically. There's no reason that Gaza, given this kind of same city-state aspect, I mean, they want more land for peace. But they had a fair amount of land there. As we see, they've lost a fair amount, and there's still people there. And it's like, and they have the beach. They're right in the Mediterranean. They're basically a boat ride from, Italy or whatever. And it's like, make that into something productive. But the money, the billions that got thrown there by the Qataris and whatnot, where does it go? It literally, they shoved it underground. They buried it. And in tunnels. And then the Gaza metro is not a Gaza metro for anybody else but terrorism. If they had an actual metro there, they'd have something. Who knows?
Yep, absolutely. This is it. And these are the people who our erstwhile colleagues support and are friends with.
Yeah. No, it's hard to say.
I mean, the worst thing is it's not even. It's not even. This is what the viciousness. It's not even that they want the whatever, the destruction of Gaza to stop. They want Israel to be destroyed. These people, they're open about it. I had people say, well, why should there shouldn't be a Jewish state? They should go back to where they came from.
They shouldn't necessarily be an English state or a Belgian
go back to where you came. These are the people. This is another interesting thing. So people who say they should go back to where they came from are the people who, if for example you look at the fact that in London now there's less than 40% of the people are white British, right? Born white British. You say, and even just saying that, they say you're disgusting. Everybody else has every right to be here as anyone else.
Well,
but the Jews have been living in Israel all their lives and for generations. No, they don't have a right to be. They don't have a right to be there. These people. But anyone who emigrates to London absolutely has a right. But no, that.
Well, I don't know. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. I don't know how it all works out. I mean, now they're doing this huge prayer things in Times Square. It's all mutated from London and Paris and Germany and whatnot. But it's like, where does it end? I mean, it seems like it's so vocal and out. The Europe has kind of dried up. I think there are like 350,000 births in Italy last year, and the single most common name in the registry of almost every country in Europe is Muhammad. By frequency. I don't know where it ends. I mean,
it's because of that fear of, you've got that bizarre alliance, the so-called red-green alliance, with the Islamists and the leftists, right? They're the ones who are doing all these protests. Mm-hmm. It's got and the politicians are so scared of that alliance that it's frightening for Jews in the UK. So for example, even any event which has any kind of like Jewish angle, like a book event or anything, it's got nothing to do with Israel or anything like that, completely non-political event, that can't go ahead now because the venues won't allow it, because they consider it to be, a potential target of these people. So, and the police have become completely politicized with this, which is why they arrest the people who are protesting, who are just simply stating facts like Hamas is a terrorist organization, rather than those who are, chanting death to the Jews.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to have to go because I've just realized to be on to 10. I've got to give my wife her dinner now, because I can hear that she's actually.
All right. Well, I'm good having you. Thank you so much for being on, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah.